exciting event, doesn't it? So I'd prepared some thoughts based on what I was hoping possibly Nick might say, but obviously we don't know yet what he said. But I had a hunch, given that there's been a sort of common theme over the past few years, that he would probably emphasize the importance that every single child, kind of perhaps especially those children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but every child is taught in schools with a really extensive knowledge-rich curriculum by well-trained and supported teachers. And if he had said anything along those lines, then I would have agreed with him quite strongly, because of course it's right. But I think nationally we're still kind of too far from achieving that. So we've made really important steps towards a knowledge-rich, discipline-led curriculum, but it's not there yet. And certainly around the teacher training and support on that knowledge-led, extensive, discipline-led curriculum, it's lagging far behind. So yeah, give me a clue, John. How long shall I?
I'll ask you some questions. Could you define for us what a knowledge-rich means? I mean, it's a term that has, I think, lost some of its meaning and is become incredibly broad. What does it mean to you, and what do you think it means in practice?
That's a great question. Can I have the remaining 56 minutes on it? Because
yes, you can.
It's also quite a big one. So absolutely, it does mean different things to different people. I think it probably began being used to contrast with practices that people felt needed improving. So rather than it being kind of a term in its own right, it's there because people wanted to say that maybe some practices were insufficiently knowledge rich. And for me, the way that most powerfully manifest was where maybe people had lower expectations of what certain children might be expected to know. And I think we had got into a situation where some children were arriving at school with quite a lot of knowledge and quite a lot of awareness and understanding of society, of geography, of history, with a, we know, much more extensive vocabulary than their peers who didn't have that opportunity. And maybe there was a tendency for us as teachers to assume that those children who brought that were either more intelligent or capable of more, or that we should have higher expectations of them, and to kind of go with the knowledge that they brought and build from that. And of course, the real kind of terrible thing that happens there is that you end up expecting less and not building up the knowledge and educating those children who maybe haven't started with that same advantage.
I think that is a fantastic explanation, and one that I'm sure Nick was ready to give us himself. So I believe Nick Gibb, Conservative MP for Bognor Regis and Littlehampton, and of course the Schools Minister for much of what seems like eternity, Nick, but actually was the last 10 years. Nick, do you want to give us live from Parliament your views on the question?
Yes, I think my video has been disabled. I don't know whether you can re-able it. Okay. Yep.
There we go.
Very good. Yeah, sorry. I mean, I agree with everything Helen said. I think the whole essence of a knowledge-based curriculum is what E.D. Hirsch, and I've mentioned him in the first sentence, would call the Matthew effect. To each, to the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And so the more knowledge you have, the more you can build on knowledge. He refers to knowledge as a Velcro, that it attracts new knowledge. So if you come from a family where knowledge abounds in your home, then you are well equipped to acquire new knowledge. And he cites the example of an electron. You're teaching about an electron orbiting an atom, and if you say, well, this is just like the way the planets orbit the sun. If you don't know the planets orbit the sun, then that simile is lost on you. So that's one example that Hirsch gives in his book. And in those opposition years, what we were coming across, because Labour was introducing not Labour, it was the Labour government, but it was the QCA and the QCDA as it became. We're introducing a competence-based curriculum. And the essence of a competence-based curriculum is that it has a series of sort of general aptitudes at its core. For example, successful learners who enjoy learning, that make progress and achieve confident individuals who are able to live safe, healthy, and fulfilled lives, responsible citizens. It's these kind of objectives that were at the core of a competence-based national curriculum that was introduced in 2007. And then that translates on a subject-by-subject basis into the skills of that particular subject. So in history, for example, it's this skill of historical inquiry, using evidence, communicating about the past. And a school can then teach as little or as much as it wants to about the history curriculum, provided it teaches those skills. So it may well not cover whole rafts of really complex and important parts of our history, so long as it teaches those skills. And Daisy Christodoulou, as you know, in 7 Myths, explains why you can't teach an amateur, a child, those skills of an experienced professional in the way that is purported by those who believe in a competence-based curriculum. So what we did when we came into office is we tried to address this. And I came across E.D. Hirsch, and I read his book, one of his books, The Schools We Need and Why We Don't Have Them, on the beach in South Carolina one summer holiday. And it was a revelation because it encapsulated and crystallized for the layperson all those issues that I knew were undermining education in our country, this progressive education, and explained really what it actually meant in great detail. And so when I came into office in 2010, and I by the way, John, I've been recommending this book, Hirsch, to everybody I met, journalists, other politicians, Michael Gove, because it was such a really good explanation of why knowledge was important and what was wrong with the education system. So when I came into office, the first thing that I was presented with in sanctuary buildings by the Civil Service was a bound copy of the E.D. Hirsch core knowledge sequence, ready to, if you like, be introduced into the English system. And the battle lines were drawn. And if you just hear the kind of things that for example, the Association of Teachers and Lecturers were saying, as it was then, now part of NEU. And what they said on their website at the time was, and I quote, "A 21st century curriculum cannot have the transfer of knowledge at its core. It cannot be an academic curriculum where pupils spend most of their time reading and writing and learning facts that have been organized into academic subjects." They were totally opposed to that, and which appears to me to be the essence of what an education is all about. And they took the view that you had to learn how to learn and not necessarily the content, because you could always look things up in Google and so on. But of course, if you've read Hirsch and others, you know that this isn't a new argument that came with Google. This was an argument made in the 20s by Teachers College Columbia, that you can look things up in encyclopedias and so on, and you don't need to learn this knowledge. And so I've, as you know, John, I've taken a very strong view that you only build up those skills, that skills of historian, the skills of creativity or critical thinking, if you have that domain knowledge, because you can't transfer thinking skills from one domain into another. They simply, they don't transfer. They are very subject specific. So when we came into office, we launched a curriculum review chaired by Tim Oates from Cambridge Assessment. And we revised, starting with a primary curriculum in English, maths, and science. We went through it, and we produced a year-by-year, very detailed curriculum covering right from Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, learning to read, phonics, vocabulary, grammar, spelling, becoming somebody who enjoyed reading and so on, developing that love of reading in young people. And then Tim Oates also produced a compendium of the most successful curricula from around the world, and that was published. And we scoured the world for the best maths curriculum. That's another vote happening, but I've got a few minutes before I have to go, so I'll just carry on. I'll start it so I'll finish. And so we scoured the world, and we chose Singapore, their 2007 maths curriculum for what would be the maths curriculum for primary schools in this country. We then consulted on it, and one of the interesting things that happened when we consulted on our version of the Singapore curriculum was that in our version and the Singapore version, it emphasized the importance of practice in every area. When it went out for informal consultation, the word practice was excised from every reference. And of course, we had to put it back in. So there was very much a battle about how you teach mathematics that was going on as well. I'd love to hear Helen talk more about that battle as well, because you do need to have some things that are automatic, that you know how to multiply, you know your tables by heart and so on. So we introduced the phonic check to make sure that children were on course to learning how to read. We introduced, more recently, it's taken several years to introduce, the multiplication tables check to make sure children knew their multiplication tables by heart. Again, part of what Willingham calls automaticity, that the working memory is not sufficiently large to have to look up what 7 6s are when you're doing some algebra, or to know that Paris is the capital of France when you're talking about, you know, invasion of France and the occupation of Paris and so on. And so then, of course, we then moved on to national curriculum. I left office for a while back then, but the Key Stage 3 was much higher level on the grounds that we wanted autonomy for teachers to develop their own curricula. And then Key Stage 4 was based on subject content devised by the department in conjunction with the exam boards, signed off by the minister, and then the exam boards then developed the detailed specification. Next, Key Stage 3 has been heavily criticised by Ofsted over the years as being not, you know, wasted years and so on, I think they sometimes call it. And that's why in recent years, I've been working with subject experts and teachers on a model music curriculum, a model history curriculum we just launched with Christine Council. So going into the kind of detail that we did in the primary curriculum, Key Stage 1 and 2, in the secondary curriculum, not part of the national curriculum, just trying to spread and exemplify what the profession is doing in terms of best practice. And I think that is something that I think we need to continue that process. And of course, we then had the Ofsted 2019 Education Inspection Framework with its greater emphasis on curricula. And I can remember visiting schools and meeting head teachers who really have no interest in the curricula. This was a matter for the head of English or the head of history or head of geography. And now I think all schools and all professionals now are taking the curricula far more important. It is absolutely core to what children are learning. And the other thing that's happening, of course, John, is that the teachers themselves in this country, almost unique, I think, around the world, are really engaging and taking this debate to heart and blogging and debating. And we've got schools like Michaela, we've got multi-academy trusts like Inspiration, Future, Dixon's and so on, STAR, are really producing their own very high quality knowledge-rich curriculum. I think this is absolutely key, as Helen said in her introduction, to social mobility. It's about making sure that children who do not come from knowledge-rich homes with books and discussion and trips to the museums and theatres, that they do get that same diet at school that might have been denied to them at home. And so therefore closing that attainment gap between children from disadvantaged backgrounds and their more advantaged peers. That's what lies at the core of having a proper knowledge-rich curriculum. So that's my starter for 10, John, and I hope to now nip and vote, and then I'd love to resume the discussion that's now going to take place.
It's a good example, Nick, of multiple skills and crossing domains, I think, live from Parliament. So if we come back to Helen while Nick's voting, we'll give her a proper intro now. So it's Dr. Helen Drury, Director of Curriculum Programmes at ARK Curriculum Plus. Helen, you know, you were saying before Nick's piece there that you don't think this work is done, and Nick's outlined some extensive changes over the past 10 years. Where are we on the spectrum of, you know, beginning, middle, and end? Are we more middle than end? How much longer do we have to wait?
Great question. I was hoping to share a little bit about what we've been doing within ARK and at ARK Curriculum Plus to try and get closer to the end. I don't know whether that's a very positive aim, but to move further on this journey, because I think nationally we've got a much stronger appreciation of the problem and a really good understanding that there is a kind of burning social mobility platform here around having strong curriculum and excellent teaching of the subjects in our schools. And we've understood the power of that kind of coherent, academically ambitious curriculum where knowledge is carefully sequenced and designed to support memory. But what's maybe a little bit different in emphasis from what Nick shared with us so far impressively whilst multitasking, is making sure that it's both substantive and disciplinary knowledge that's being shared. So I'm happy to say a little bit more about that, and also looking forward to talking about both phonics and times tables a bit later. But first, what have we been doing about it? Essentially, I guess, kind of seen the untapped power of collaboration. So like figuring out what's the most powerful knowledge and then defining that really specifically and sequencing it logically, and then finding kind of bite-sized effective ways so that every single teacher, even if they've got, you know, a high workload, challenging context, maybe not that experienced, they need to understand the knowledge, they need to understand the rationale for the sequencing, and then they need to bring kind of evidence-informed approaches to their exposition and to their task design and to their pedagogy. Like that is massive. That is such a massive job. And somehow we've agreed that it's a job that needs doing, but I don't think we've quite recognized just how enormous that is. And like, we're trying hard not to over mystify it. I don't think it needs to be a really complicated job. It's just huge. And we don't think it's practical to expect a single teacher or a single department or school or even a single multi-academy trust to be trying to tackle that job on their own.
You've actually, I'll come back to your question later. Let's go to Chloe Wardle. Let's give you a chance to talk, Chloe. She is Learning Design Fellow at the Ambition Institute. Chloe, what would you like to pick up from these discussions so far?
So ahead of today, John, I had a little think about sort of where ambition sits within these conversations that we've been alluding to around like the change in policy around curriculum, and thought about like what we've done at Ambition to try and bridge that gap really between curriculum policy changes and what's happening in schools, like the practice that we see happening in schools. And when I was thinking about that, there were kind of like two big policy changes that I think our work has most recently responded to. And the first was talked about, Nick was talking about a bit earlier, which was the introduction of the new national curriculum in 2014 with its emphasis on knowledge and those raised expectations of pupil attainment. So that was the first. And then the second big policy change that we've been responding to here at Ambition is the new Ofsted inspection framework from 2019, which of course, as we all know, put increased emphasis on the curriculum. And that quality of education strand really brought to the fore the importance of a broad and balanced curriculum rather than teach to the test, as well as sort of underlining the importance of subject-specific expertise. And when Ambition came into being in its current form after the merger in 2018, schools had already begun responding to like at least that first policy change, which was the introduction of the new national curriculum. And so we already had a feel in 2018 for what some of the challenges were that schools were facing. And we, as a provider of teacher education programs, were keen to respond to those challenges that the educators were facing through our program materials. And like the three biggest challenges that we noticed schools were facing were these. The first was like a lack of expertise. So there was a limited understanding within the sector at that time about how to construct a curricula. It wasn't something that people were well versed in doing, at least in recent memory. And there were also a number of misconceptions around about like what a knowledge curriculum looked like, why you might want to teach one, and equally the importance of subject-specific knowledge, the subject expertise that you need to construct subject curricula hadn't been like a priority really for a number of years. So there was that lack of expertise. Second, there were challenges around accountability. So with the introduction of the new national curriculum, schools became accountable to meeting those higher standards. And this led many to narrow their curricula to teaching to assessment frameworks to make sure that they met those higher standards. And then, of course, the 2019 Ofsted framework focused on constructing a broad and balanced curriculum that went beyond teaching to the test, that wasn't narrowly teaching to the test. So there were two different accountability measures there that schools have been held accountable that they were finding challenging to reconcile. And the third thing that we picked up on in 2018 was how educators were feeling around that time. So anyone, and I include myself here, anyone who was working in a school during those years knows just how tough it was implementing those policy changes. And although many educators would have been aligned with the aims of those policies, as Nick's just been alluding to, you know, at making sure that every single child gets the best possible education, although many educators would have been aligned with those aims, the feat of implementing them perhaps obscured their understanding of those aims, obscured their vision of those aims. So at that time, re-engaging teachers and leaders with their aims as educators and showing them how through implementing those policy changes they could achieve those aims was something that we wanted to do within our programs. And so it was kind of within that context that we created a curriculum program called the Expert Middle Leaders Program, or EML, which was like a 2-year DFE funded program, which supported middle leaders who are perhaps newer to the profession and lacked, therefore, the sort of curriculum expertise that I was talking about earlier. And through the program, our main aim, and our main aim through all of our curriculum programs indeed, is to support educators to develop their curriculum expertise so that they could respond in an informed way to the specific challenges that they were facing within their own settings. And I'll just say briefly what our approach was on EML to achieving that aim. And it's broadly speaking very similar to the approaches that we take on many of our programs. So it started with a sort of deep dive into the evidence base. So we started by looking at the research and considering like what we think educators need to know to improve their school curricula. And of course, one of the main bodies of evidence that we drew on was what we know about how pupils learn. Because at the same time as there were those significant shifts in policy taking place, so there was an increased interest and understanding across the sector in the science of learning. And this meant that our evidence base ended up being quite diverse. So we were drawing on the more sort of empirical findings of cognitive science at the same time as we were drawing on like the hypotheses within curriculum theory. And then once we've done that sort of like deep dive sifting through the evidence, what we did was to explicitly teach that evidence base to the participants on our program by considering such questions as like, what do we mean by knowledge-rich curriculum, as we talked about earlier, why might you want to teach one? And importantly, we started the program by thinking about what were the purpose and the aims of education as a whole. Thinking about why we educate really foreshadows all the work that we do on curriculum, and we select particular content for our curricula to meet particular aims that we want to achieve. And it was especially pertinent in the context that I've sketched out, because at that time we wanted to help participants to reconnect with their own aims as educators and see how addressing some of the policy shifts could help them to achieve those. And then sort of the final step in that process was helping educators to then put that theory into practice, because it's all very well knowing something, but it doesn't mean that you can necessarily then go and do it in your own school. So we we shared with them a variety of scaffolds to help them put that theory into practice in their context, which included such things as like a crib sheet, which guided them through step by step the processes that you would need to go through to construct a subject curricula, giving them a bank of examples of what that looked like in different phases and different subjects, as well as giving them sort of personalized support through an academic tutor. And so through like selecting and explicitly teaching the theory and then supporting participants to turn that theory into practice, we help them develop that expertise in curriculum that perhaps they didn't have at that time so much within the sector, and meeting those chief challenges that we identified. And broadly speaking, like I said, like that is kind of what we would do on other curriculum programs as well. But our curriculum programs are, like, as all curricula are, constantly evolving. And so it's interesting to hear what Helen's saying about like thinking about how now we're thinking more about a sort of disciplinary turn within knowledge rather than just a substantive knowledge, you know, and that's one of the threads that certainly we're picking up on in reviewing and refining our curriculum materials. And there are others as well, which I could talk about. But just to say, like, it's an ongoing process, really, like how we approach the curriculum on curriculum and how we best support educators to improve the curricula at their schools.
Thank you very much. I think we got Nick back, and I believe. And so
Yes,
if you
yes.
are there, Nick, I'm gonna pose two questions based on what Helen and Chloe have said to you, if that's okay. And it's an annoying two-question journalist question. The first one is that much of this curriculum shift has been sort of pushed through on a sort of rhyme and reason of disadvantaged children. So the first part of the question is how neat a definition is disadvantaged children, and is this something for everyone? So i.e., is disadvantaged children a useful term in talking about a lack of the sort of stuff you're talking about, which is word knowledge, which is cultural capital, which is some of the other elements? And the second part of the question is that what we've seen through what Chloe and Helen have said is that there was an implementation task here. And I'm interested in how far the implementation challenge was part of your policy thinking right at the start.
These are both very good questions. I mean, the first point to make really is, we do have a definition of disadvantage, which is eligibility for the pupil premium, which is based on eligibility for certain benefits. But it doesn't, and we do know that those children do face, in aggregate, on average, not in every specific case, greater challenges than children from other backgrounds. And that's why we have the pupil premium. It's a £2.5 billion a year program. But that's really almost a separate issue from this, because it's an axiomatic definition, if you like. You are disadvantaged if you come from a home. Sorry, a phone call came in. If you come from a home that doesn't have that kind of knowledge-rich environment at home, so you don't come to school knowing where France is, you don't know the seven oceans, the continents and so on, and therefore you are at a disadvantage, and your vocabulary as well will be narrower than other children. We know all the definitions of the millions of words that children from some homes have compared with the very few words that other children have, and those things matter, because again, the wider your vocabulary, the easier you comprehend what you're reading, and the more easily you comprehend, the more you read, and the more you read, the more you know. So that gap widens. So I think it almost doesn't matter how you define disadvantage for this purpose. The real definition is whether you come from a knowledge-rich home. Mm-hmm. Then the other issue is implementation, which I think is a question to ask. It's something that Professor Robin Alexander raised during the development of the curriculum, and it is an important issue. But I take the view that we are talking about a profession of 460,000 highly educated, very well motivated people in the teaching profession who are absolutely capable of delivering the curriculum that is required of them. And what we had to get right, I always say this in policy terms, we've got to get the documentation right, so that what they are being asked to do is the thing that the evidence says works. And then we can then work out, with the profession, how they're going to go about doing that. But getting the documentation right is crucial. And what I did know is that the documentation was not right. The 2007 competence-based curriculum was driving a kind of teaching that the evidence did not say would produce the best outcomes, particularly, as I say, for people from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Do you think, I'll come to Helen on this, what Nick was talking about there is knowledge breeds knowledge, essentially. And what I'm interested in perhaps is, does knowledge drive motivation as well? I mean, does more knowledge drive you to want to learn more? And is that a universal effect of a knowledge-rich curriculum?
Who are you asking that to?
That's to Helen, sorry.
I know that I said at the beginning in your answer, John, to what knowledge rich was, that I felt the term was often used to contrast with alternatives. And I was listening really carefully to Nick when he was talking about the work of the QCDA. And I agree that with them, the documentation wasn't right. I'm concerned that maybe maybe if I hadn't been paying proper attention, maybe Nick might have said that we didn't think that the education system should produce responsible citizens, or didn't think that it had a role to play in ensuring that they were safe, or we didn't want them to have the skills of historical inquiry. And of course, he can't possibly have said that, and I'm sure he didn't at all mean that, but I think it has been a problem, perhaps, of the documentation this time around, that we've kind of assumed that these 460,000 professionals are sort of used to, of course, making sure that they're responsible citizens and they're going to be safe, and in their history lessons they're going to learn the skills of historical inquiry. So the focus has to be on really emphasizing that none of that's worth anything if the majority of the children going through the system don't have sufficient knowledge to be doing that in a meaningful way. And I kind of feel we kind of swung the pendulum a bit too far. And as Chloe was saying, like, tended to be really having lots of focus and discussion about knowledge rich, and rightly so, but lost sense maybe kind of nationally of like, what is education for? Because I don't think anyone ever thought that education had stopped being about us wanting all of those things that the QCDA was talking about. And now suddenly instead, we just wanted to ram children full of knowledge and facts. Nobody ever thought that for a minute, but it's a quite considerable national misunderstanding at the moment that that's what the knowledge rich thing was all about. And that people think that all of the QCDA's work and their aims and ambitions that they might have had for the education system, that that's somehow thought by some people, including Nick, to be wrong. And that instead it's about increasing children's vocabulary and them having a knowledge and understanding of the world. And I would argue that an education system, of course, obviously, why are we even still talking about it, is both. You need both.
Nick, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because the knowledge rich shift became a battle, and you referenced that yourself. You knew that it was going to be a battle. Do you think there was a way of bringing the profession with you, or do you think you needed to take what some may seem was a more extreme position to then get to the point you wanted, to break the eggs, if it were? I think we need to unmute Nick.
Yes, I don't accept that I don't accept the premise that the profession wasn't with us on this. In addressing Helen's comments, this distinction was made by Tim Oates between the school curriculum and the national curriculum. And the school curriculum is everything beyond history and geography and math and science and language. It's music and art. It's those other things. It's instilling character and behavior and how to get on in society, sharing, friendship. All those things are part of the school curriculum. They don't have to be in the history or the geography curriculum. And then the other point to make about historical inquiry and working scientifically and mathematically, those are what Daisy Christodoulou talks about. They are the skills of an expert. And what the competence-based curriculum seeks to do is to directly teach the skills of an expert. An expert can identify sources of evidence, and from it can identify all kinds of interesting things. Let's teach that skill to a child who's never heard of Henry VIII. And it's a nonsense. That expert who can get so much from a Victorian cartoon in the Times has a huge amount of knowledge about the Victorian era, you have to start with that, and also, of course, by making sure that you are teaching all that knowledge, you are increasing the child's vocabulary, you are teaching them to read a history book, which again is an important literary skill, which I think we sometimes neglect. English literacy is not just about the English lesson; it has to be about those other lessons as well. So I would say that we do want children to be creative, we do want them to be engaged, to be able to critically think. But you get those skills not by having them taught directly in today's lesson is critical thinking. You get them from being good at maths, from having a good knowledge of science, from having seen experiments, from having a really good knowledge of the history and geography of the world, and being able to speak of introduced to foreign language and have read a lot of important literature. That's how you get those skills that we do want children to have.
I think this leads us nicely to one of the questions that, there's various versions of this on the Q&A. the most common sort of question around this anyway, and in the chat, is that, okay, who decides the knowledge? And I know from talking to Hirsch says culture decides the knowledge. You know, the knowledge exists almost as this separate entity that culture decides. How do you view that? How do you view the canon, if you like, the must knows?
I think that is a tricky question, and it is the question, particularly when you come to history, it is the question that is so challenging, if you like, that people think, oh, it's too hard, let's just revert to a skills-based curriculum. And I think there are all kinds of mechanical ways in which you can devise this. It is as Hirsch said, as you've said, it is about the culture, about what we teach, what we know other people have been taught, so that they can converse in that national conversation with other people, and they don't feel that they can't participate because they've never heard of the Plantagenets. But I think in a mechanical way, how do you decide it? You decide it in a national conversation. That's how you decide it. And of course, what it then gets bound up in is this sort of jingoistic view that, you know, England was the greatest and it's never done anything wrong. And of course, it isn't, and it hasn't. And you have to teach the bad and the good when you're teaching about history. But I think once you sit down with a group of well-meaning people, it isn't difficult to decide what should be taught in geography at which age. And we did it in maths, and we did it in English, we did it in science and primary, very detailed year by year, and it wasn't really that difficult to come to consensus.
Chloe, if you do you want to come back on that, and you know, in your experience of the people on your program, what was the most difficult bit? I know you outlined some of the big barriers. Was choosing the content for those who had, you know, their own curriculum to choose the sequences exactly, etc. Was that a big barrier? Was that something that people on those courses talked about?
Yeah, it was. But I think even before that, one of the main barriers, as I spoke out, was that like misconception around what we mean by a knowledge-rich curriculum. So like that was where we started with our program, was spelling out what we meant by a knowledge-rich curriculum, which sometimes was, for many participants, like the key to opening that door was just understanding that a knowledge-rich curriculum was talking about declarative and procedural knowledge. Because the word skills is used in many different ways within education, and sometimes the word skills is used to mean procedural knowledge. So once like that kind of misconception had been addressed, that a knowledge-rich curriculum was about procedural knowledge as much as it was about declarative knowledge, then that really helped to get participants moving along on a journey with us. And then I think the next step in that was picking up on the point that I know Nick's alluded to a couple of times already, like the importance of that knowledge base to critical thinking. And like understanding critical thinking and pupils' ability to engage with the school subjects in different ways, like being at the heart of what we actually wanted to achieve as educators. So at the heart of what we wanted to achieve as educators is very seldom to fill pupils' heads with knowledge. What we wanted to achieve as educators was to give pupils the tools that they need to apply their knowledge to problems that they're going to encounter in the real world. And that kind of like pulls us into like what we think like the purpose of education is. And that to me is what kind of sits at the heart of our curriculum thinking, as I alluded to earlier. Like all of our choices around what we want our pupils to learn start from understanding what it is we are trying to achieve through the education system. And so just to come back to where we started, which I think was around like what participants were finding difficult. Yes, participants were finding it challenging to select the precise content that they wanted to include in their knowledge-rich curriculum. And if I had the program to do over, I would include, and indeed it's something that we're looking at the moment on our programs, would include more opportunity to engage with that question of what are the purpose and aims of our education system. Because we kind of did it enough in order that participants had the opportunity to consider their own perspective, their own position in relation to the policy changes that were made at that time, so that they could find where they met in the middle and get behind those policy changes and put those knowledge, start constructing those knowledge-rich curricula in their settings. But they perhaps didn't have enough opportunity to engage with those questions about the purpose and aims in education, such that they could make well-informed, thoughtful decisions about precisely what curriculum content they wanted to include. So I think we did at that time, in our first sort of iterations of our curriculum programs, a really good job, actually, if I can say so myself, of helping participants to classify the knowledge. So one of the things that we've alluded to in our conversation so far is that distinction between substantive and disciplinary knowledge, right? There are lots of different classifications of knowledge. And we helped them to classify that knowledge and sort it such that they could then sequence it logically. But we kind of didn't unearth enough what sits at the heart of curriculum thinking, which is what is your purpose and aims as an educator. And that's what helps you to decide what actually you're going to put on your curriculum, and helps you to address some of these questions that we've alluded to around like EDI within the curriculum.
Nick, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because both Helen and Chloe have alluded to the fact that the first thing you decide before deciding your curriculum is, what is the purpose of my role? What is the purpose of education? Do we have to accept that there'll be a multiplicity of definitions for the purpose of education? Should it be centrally set what that purpose is? Did within the Department for Education, did you have a multiplicity of purposes?
I think this is a problem only because we're moving from here to there. If we already had a knowledge-rich curriculum in place, then what happens then is you tweak it year on year, because another year has elapsed in history. There's been a whole bunch of new inventions, new discoveries in science, a new, better understanding of everything, and a whole bunch of new books have been written. So in a normal system, of course, you take what you had before, you drop a few things, and you introduce some new things, and you update others. And that's really what should be happening. The problem we've got, of course, is we're coming from an education system that has effectively abandoned a lot of that and are teaching the sort of skills of the subject's domain skills with knowledge, but the knowledge is subsidiary to the skills. You teach the skills as the primary objective, and you use the knowledge in order to teach those skills. And that means that then the knowledge we don't have that sort of whole basis of what we've taught in previous years, and just need to update it year on year. So that's where the challenges come. But of course, the schools have been doing this now. ARK has been doing it, Ambition has been doing it. Other multi-academy trusts have been doing it very effectively, and so has Oak. And now we have a sort of basis on which to improve and as years go by, incrementally make it better than it was the previous year. And I think that's what we have to do. And then it is obvious what is taught, and there'll be some issues at the edge where there'll be a discussion about whether to teach a particular author or whether to teach a particular period of history or a particular part of the world. But they are issues at the margin. I think it does become very clear what an educated person needs to have in their long-term memory. They do need to know their way around the globe. They need to know where the Sudan is, where France is, what the capital of France is. They need to know. They need to have some perspective about distances. So some of these things are really quite obvious what they do need to be taught, and a lot of these things were not taught. Children didn't know which countries bordered on which countries, and this then makes the world opaque. And the same applies to science, it applies to literature, it applies to history. You say, what is the purpose of education? I've always said it's about being able to give children the basic vocabulary in a subject discipline to enable them to read on when they leave school. But it's also to make the world a clearer place, so they can contribute to the society effectively and understand it and do well in it. And I think that's where you need this knowledge. You need to know the history of the country, you need to know the way around the world, the way around your own country, the counties, the rivers, the mountains of your own country, so that it's a clearer place in which you can navigate your own life.
I guess in that definition, it's about education as a purpose for understanding the world. One of the questions, I'm going to come to you, Helen, if that's okay. One of the questions, Helen, multiple questions on the Q&A actually are, what if the purpose of education is employability? What if what is valued is by teachers and society is competencies that allow you to get a job. How do you respond to that question?
Well, it is one of the purposes, isn't it? Because it's obviously not the only purpose. But I mean, Chloe put it very well earlier that in any of the subjects on the curriculum, we want the children to have knowledge, not as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. So we want the children to have knowledge that they then have to such depth that they can apply that to different contexts. And I won't put words into her mouth, but I suspect that she didn't for a minute mean that, like, in every lesson that's what be happening, that suddenly the lesson needs to be about applying that knowledge in a real world context. It's that the ultimate aim, so when you're selecting the knowledge or when you're thinking about how you're going to teach that knowledge to the children, you don't think the end goal is they'll know more stuff. You think the end goal is that they'll have ownership of all of the stuff that Nick so eloquently explains is vital to then think critically in those domain specific ways. And just having that as the ultimate aim doesn't necessarily always make what's happening in an individual lesson look that different. But I think it's vital for the teacher that they don't think they're in some kind of conflict between like knowledge teaching for its own sake versus knowledge for some kind of end goal. Remind me what the question is, John, and I'll attempt to answer.
You answered it very well, Helen, I think. But also, I have a follow-up question, because you were saying it's not necessarily something that the child would notice, but it's something that's important for the teacher to understand. Where do parents come in for this? Do you find in your experience that a parent engages with education on a curriculum level? And if so, if yes, do they, in your experience, is this something they're after? Do they understand it? And if no, is that a problem?
I think that this dichotomy that seems to be sort of passionately felt and fought by the education profession is not so much the case for parents, except, of course, the massive number of parents that are also teachers. But most parents don't seem to question phonics and also love of reading. Obviously, that's good. The child needs to be able to read, and they need to really enjoy reading. Ta-da! In maths, I expect they should be able to solve some problems. Wouldn't want them to have just, learn everything by rote. But of course they have to practice. And of course it's a benefit to know your times tables. Otherwise it's going to be tricky, isn't it? So in my experience, it's sort of surprising to parents that the profession is having to sort of, I think, battle its way a bit through this, because they kind of assume we'd figured out all this stuff a while ago.
It's interesting you mentioned phonics check and the multiplication check. I mean, Nick, can you perhaps explain the relationship between the accountability levers for a knowledge-rich curriculum and the purity of that curriculum, if I'm not being too highfalutin in how I've described that? But can they coexist happily?
Yes, I mean, I heard the earlier discussion when I think it was Chloe talking about the tendency to the curriculum to be narrowed because of the accountability at primary is on really maths and English, and therefore the tendency then is to drive out any teaching of history, geography, science. And this is just another discussion we have to have. My own view is, you want to do well in the reading SATs, particularly after 2016, you have to make sure children have a wide vocabulary beyond just the kind of vocabulary you see in fiction. There needs to know what a peninsula is, and ancestors, and all these kind of words that can appear in literature. And the way to do well in those SATs is to have read widely, and the way you read widely is to have a wide vocabulary, and that means being taught subjects like science and geography and history to help you widen that vocabulary. And getting that message across has not always been successful. And it saddens me when schools do narrow the curriculum in order to think they're going to do well in the SATs by doing that. And it's actually the opposite is the case. But these are the kind of discussions you just keep having to have in the education debate. And but I think the accountability is still important, because English and maths are crucial for primary school children if they're going to do well at secondary school. And then, of course, the reason why we introduced the EBAC performance measure at secondary was to make sure that children were being were being exposed to a very wide, John Hayes just saying hello there, how we're being saying hello to, we're being introduced to a wide, what I would call a balanced curriculum: English, maths, history, humanities, science, foreign language. I think that is a balanced curriculum, although we're accused of narrowing the curriculum by having the EBAC as a performance measure. I think it does actually make sure that children have a broad and balanced curriculum at secondary school. So you can use the accountability measure to, and of course then we have the, as Chloe mentioned as well, the 2019 education inspection framework, which of course talks about a broad curriculum as well.
Do you have a sense of where the line is where this knowledge-rich curriculum becomes useful? So where is too little knowledge? Where is too much knowledge? If that's a problem, do you have like a personal sense of where that line is? But also, is there a research evidence base that says this is the body of knowledge at this point which creates an understanding and a foundation for lifelong learning? Or is that too abstract to pin down to in a research study?
I don't know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that knowledge is not simply a bunch of facts. It's not just, William I, 1066, William II, blah, blah, blah. It is what happened in those periods, the stories of the leading people in the country at that time, and the intellectual, depending on the age group that you're teaching. But this is what dismayed me about the skills-based, competence-based curricula, that it drove out the complexity of the knowledge, the intellectual battles between church and state, between executive and parliament, and so on. All these issues, the differences of opinion between cabinet ministers and the government. These are really interesting things that should be taught, and they can't be taught if you're too busy worrying about teaching historical skills. And actually, by learning about these disputes in the past, you actually do gain a greater understanding of the world. You become a more critical thinker because you're aware of the critical issues that were faced in the past, and you can learn from those. So I don't know what the quantum of knowledge is, but you can look around the world and see the level of mathematics being taught in Shanghai and Singapore, and we just need to make sure that we're teaching that level of mathematics in this country. And you can look around the world to see the vocabulary levels of children in different countries and make sure that we're doing the same in this country.
Helen, on a curriculum creation level, at school level, how far is the balancing act between workload, timetable, getting everything in, and this idea of the right level of knowledge that we need to impart?
In our experience, having not only embarked on the creation of all of the kind of the curriculum structure and the sequencing, but then also the kind of classroom resourcing and thinking through what teacher exposition and what task design might best support that learning. We've done that in the first place, and we've begun the really exciting piece, which Nick was talking about as like absolutely imperative to all of this working long term, right? Which is going back and reviewing it and checking that we had the right knowledge in the right order, and actually has somebody written a brilliant new book, or is there a brilliant new play, or what's changed in history, etc. So we're at that year-on-year review stage, and we are doing it across hundreds of schools and supporting hundreds of thousands of primary and secondary pupils, and it's still an enormous job, like really, really enormous job, and incredibly kind of time consuming. And yet we're doing lots of collaboration and involving lots of classroom teachers. But for any of them to do that whole piece, like to create an entire Key Stage 3 English curriculum or Key Stage 1 and 2 maths curriculum on their own, I just don't think that can be done well by an individual school. There's just not, unless we learn from higher performing digital jurisdictions about teacher workload as well as other things.
Nick, we've got about 1 minute. I'm interested if there's one thing you want everyone to take away from this conversation, if there's one thing you want people to remember about curriculum or to bear in mind, what would that one thing be?
That if you want the skills that everybody on both sides of this debate want, critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, the things that drive a modern economy, then you need to have a knowledge-rich curriculum, and that's really what drives it. And just to address Helen's point, it saddens me that in the 70s we lost a lot of textbooks. There was a move against textbooks in schools, and particularly in primary schools, where you've got one teacher who teaches everything, who's a generalist, and he is never going to know everything about science and history and geography and how to teach reading. I mean, and maths. It's impossible, and that's why we need to think about high quality textbooks returning to our school system that are just teeming with knowledge that children can read ahead if they want. But it helps the teacher then to make sure that they're teaching a knowledge-rich curriculum. But all these things are happening. They're happening because the multi-academy trust, like ARK and Ambition and so on, are actually producing really high quality curricula that will then lead, I hope, in time to much better quality textbooks that schools can use.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists tonight. It's been a fascinating discussion. There is a survey that will be sent out or put in the chat for people to fill out, and sign-ups for the next ArkTalks event are open now. Yep, Saf has put that in the chat for you for the details. Thank you for your time. Congratulations, Nick, on balancing voting and speaking on a public debate at the same time. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. Sorry I didn't get through all the questions, but I'm sure these discussions will continue.